Well, things got really dark as shit.
Those were up, and they did.
We're smart, and my...
He told me enough!
No, I.
Here's Chuck!
Hey everyone, it's Don G. Corleone here, and I'm here with a brand new movie review. And this movie review is going to be for the second installment of one of two review series franchises I'm doing for this review series for June. And the first review to hit for the first week of June. And this is a movie, first full week of June anyways. And this is for a second installment that's not really a sequel, considered to be a prequel film. And is one of the few that actually doesn't do the same villains, the only one anyways. And that film is going to be for none other than 1984's Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, which is once again done by George Spielberg and Lucas from Raiders. And also, the second installment of the Indiana Jones franchise, and, believe it or not, the first film to invent a new rating. So anyways, what is the plot? Well, Indiana Jones teams up with a nightclub singer named Willie Scott and a 12-year-old Chinese boy named Short Round. They end up in a small distressed village in India where the people believe that evil spirits have taken all their children away after a sacred precious stone was stolen. They also discover the great mysterious terror surrounding a booby-trapped temple known as the Temple of Doom. Thuggee is literally beginning an attempt to rise once more, and believing that with the power of all five sacred stones they can rule the world. It's all up to Indiana Jones to put an end to the Thuggee campaign, rescue the slave children, win the girl, and conquer the Temple of Doom. So how was this film made? Well, Spielberg later recalled that when Lucas first approached him for Raiders, George said if he had directed the first film, he would have to direct a trilogy, because he had 3 stories in mind. And it turned out George did not have 3 stories in mind, though, when he had to make up subsequent stories. And both men even attributed to the film's tone, which was darker than Raiders, to their personal moods following the breakups of their relationships. Like, in addition, Lucas felt it had to have been a dark film, because the way Empire Strikes Back was the dark second act of the Star Wars trilogy. Spielberg even said the danger of making a sequel is that you can't satisfy everyone, and if it gave people the same movie with different scenes, then you weren't more original that way. But if you give them the same character in another fantastic adventure with a different tone, you risk disappointing the other half of the audience who just wanted a carbon copy of the first film with a different girl and a different bad guy, so you win and you lose both ways. Now, Lucas set the film in an earlier year than the first to avoid repeating the Nazis as the villains. Spielberg originally wanted to bring Marion Ravenwood back, with Ever Ravenwood considered as a possible character. In developing the story, Lucas conceived of an opening chasing with Indiana Jones on a motorcycle in the Great Wall of China, followed by the discovery of a lost world pastiche in a hidden valley inhabited by dinosaurs. Another idea was to feature the Monkey King as the plot device, but Chinese authorities refused permission for them to film in the country, requiring this different setting, and Lucas wrote the film treatment that included a haunted castle in Scotland, but Spielberg felt it was too similar to Poltergeist, so the setting transformed into a demonic temple in India. And Lucas even came up with ideas and evolved a religious cult devoted to child slavery, black magic, and ritual human sacrifice. And Lawrence Kasdan of Raiders of the Lost Ark was asked to write the script, and he didn't want to be associated with Temple of Doom though, because he reflected he just thought it was horrible, mean, nothing pleasant, and thought Temple of Doom represents a chaotic period in both their lives. And the movie is very ugly and mean-spirited. So Lucas hired William Hayek and Gloria Katz to write the script because of their knowledge of Indian culture, and Good indeed served as an influence for the film. And the two spent 4 days at Skywalker Ranch for story discussions with Lucas and Spielberg in 1982. They even said the early plot consisted of 2 notions of Lucas, that Indy would recover something stolen from a village and decide whether to give it back, and that the picture would start in China and work its way to India. And Hoyt stated Lucas was very single-minded about getting through meetings, but Steve would have always stopped and think about visual stuff. And Lucas's initial idea for Indiana's sidekick was a virginal young princess, but Hud Katz and Spielberg disliked the idea, because just as Indiana Jones named after Lucas's Alaskan Malamutes, the character Willie was named after Spielberg's Cocker Spaniel, and Short Round was named after Hike's dog, whose name was derived from the steel helmet. So anyway, after the film was shot and marketed, Temple of Doom would go on to be released 3 years after Raiders on May 23rd, 1984, to financial success, but the reviews at the time were, well, mixed. Because people did not like the darker elements, the strong violence and gore, and Capshaw's performance as Willie Scott, but critical opinion was improved since 1984 because of the film's intensity and imagination. In response to some of the more violent sequences in the film, with similar complaints about Gremlins, Spielberg suggested that the MPAA alter its rating system, which it did within 2 months of the film's release, creating the very new rating today, PG-13. And it was nominated for the Academy Award for Best Original Score, won 2 Academy Awards, the Academy Award for Best Visual Effects. And, of course, got a sequel 5 years later, The Last Crusade. So yeah, now some of you know, who don't know, how PG-13 got invented. This movie. As for my reaction, well, let me say, this might have to be one of the most underrated follow-ups in history, and I believe it deserves more praise, equal praise as Last and Raiders get. But what I liked about this movie is that it took risks to be dark as shit, and it's surprisingly one of the most violent PG movies out there. But that's the thing though, it was one of the 2 movies that invented the rating PG-13 along with Gremlins that got released a month after this, or a few weeks after this. And get this, apparently Temple of Doom was actually, believe it or not, the first Indiana Jones movie I saw. This was how I got introduced to the franchise in 2008, which was ironically the year Kane with the Crystal Skull came out. Got introduced to the franchise a few weeks before Kingdom. And yeah. And of course, the movie really starts out like a roller coaster ride, with a moderate pace, and then it gets faster, more exhilarating, and then we reach a breathtaking climax. While some people dislike the dark themes, which definitely involve child labor and frightening sacrifice scenes I'll get to later, I still enjoy this movie a lot, and I like they gave it a more mature, realistic, and fresh tone. Otherwise, it just would have been Raiders all over again. And speaking of dark and brutal, the villains in this film make the ones in Raiders look cartoony and Disney-ish in comparison. The main bad guy does anyways. The characters were all fairly enjoyable and likable, and usually kids and sidekicks in films are usually sometimes can be annoying and superfluous, but Short Round actually was very likable and he did not bother me one bit. And usually, although Marion is definitely a better love interest than William Scott, which I'll also get to later, and he seemed like a tryhard in all honesty. Sure, she was a bit too fidgety and annoying at times, but I do like her in the end though. Until Crystal Skull came along, and now Dial of Destiny currently, Temple of Doom usually carry the mantle as the worst Indiana Jones movie before those 4 too. There was even a stigma attached to it as being overly violent and a bit too obscene. While I will by no means say that Temple is definitely not the best of the indie films, it still is just as entertaining and not really deserving of its odd reputation. And for a basic summary, Temple of Doom usually sees a pre-Nazi or Indiana Jones stumble into an adventure in India where he's tasked with retrieving a magic stone for an ancient village. Along the way, Indy is saddled with scene sensation Willie, and held by pin-sized precious child Short Round, played by the legendary Ki Kwan, who won an Oscar last year for Everything Ever All at Once, and briefly reunited with Harrison Ford at the Academies, in one of the most beautiful moments at the Academies yet. And from the very beginning, opening with the odd, endearing show tune Anything Goes, one can literally tell this is definitely, you can already tell this is definitely going to be a huge departure from Raiders of the Lost Ark. Generally speaking, that's definitely the right decision because Temple of Doom manages to be both original and highly entertaining, which is a difficult task at the time for any second installment of a franchise. There were a number of things that make the movie memorable. This film itself is just non-stop action and an adventure ride. Harrison Ford is once again amazing as a dashing professor and archaeologist thrill seeker, and Short Round is a lovable character who adds a humorous touch and reveals the more compassionate side of Indy's character. And the ceremony scenes are breathtaking and intense, and during those scenes in the film contain some graphic images and used justifiably to convey the real dark feel of this film and stuff. And the minecart chase scenes is one of the most amazing fast movie action sequences in any of the indie films. And you feel like you're on a roller coaster ride each time you watch it, and all those events lead to the film's spectacular and memorable climax. Every time I rewatch Temple of Doom, Yeah, I know I'm aware it's my least favorite of the original 3 movies, but the first 50 minutes of the film are just perfect in classic Indiana Jones. We get that terrific opening action sequence, and we get introduced to easily one of the greatest sidekicks yet, Short Round, and we get to see the fun back and forth between Indy and the annoyingly funny Willie Scott, and again, one of the best booby trap sequences in the whole franchise. All very terrific stuff. But let's face it, guys, making a continuation of the wonderful film Raiders of the Lost Ark seemed really impossible, because although the film had a lot more stories in, it had its great practically perfect argument. It was almost impossible to do something equally good or better. And although the film is not really as good as the first, it's still very good. Like, first of all, it's also important to mention that the film was one of the first films to create the PG-13 classification because of the violence that exceeded the first film, which was not too little. Therefore, the film is not very recommendable for people under that age, and invented a rating where some PG movies had to be watched by people 13 and up, hence PG-13. Which is what PG-13 stands for, but PG-13 doesn't really mean anything today. At all, because not a lot of films are even PG-13 today. And being the only film of the Indiana Jones saga that can really scare the shit out of young people due to its violence and dark themes, and usually the film starts out quite different from the beginning of the other Indiana Jones films that usually start off with this slow, nice score, and him on an adventure in this whole empty landscape. This one literally starts off in a nightclub in Shanghai, usually, and it even begins a dance scene, and then it comes a very fun action scene, and even a hidden reference to Star Wars that nobody notices when seeing the film for the first time, and a clear one to James Bond films. And we're introduced to the characters of the film here, and one thing I found quite curious in this film is that none of the characters we know in Raiders are here, with the exception of Indiana Jones, and that's it. Some might not find that a good thing, but it's still not a bad thing either. And then again, apparently this is supposed to be a prequel movie, which I don't feel like makes sense, because, if I'm going to be honest, guys, I've never thought of this as a prequel at all, because many reasons. Usually prequels would set up the first film that comes before it. This one doesn't even have the setup for Raiders. And it doesn't even foreshadow the events of Raiders of the Lost Ark at all, and doesn't even mention the events of Raiders of the Lost Ark, like many prequels are supposed to do, or just foreshadow the events of the films that come after it. That this movie gets made after, but it's actually set before. That's why I would rather call Temple of Doom a sequel, and just pretend it's set a year after Raiders. Okay? Like, lots of sequels don't have the same characters, except for the protagonist. Lots. And of course, director Steven Spielberg again displays himself to be a master at this kind of thing. The action sequences are constructed with rapid editing, and getting these right is not as simple as it looks. The director has to make sure each shot can convey what is going on in its brief duration, and must also keep the impression of frantic movement continuous from one shot to another. Hence, when Indy is battling the chunky guard on the conveyor belt, whenever we cut to the Maharaja and his voodoo doll, we get that turning water wheel in the background, and just to keep some moving element in an otherwise placed shot. And often, for example, during the melee at the club in Shanghai, Spielberg uses camera moves that counteract each other, such as moving the camera in one shot and moving it down to the next, which gives the sequence a punchy feel. But Spielberg is also working hard on the atmosphere in the non-action scenes, like, for example, keeping the camera back and forth in the foliage during the jungle trek, which gives this unnerving impression that our heroes are being watched. And if anything, Harrison Ford seems even better in his role as Indy this time around. He just has this smooth and sophisticated manner that makes us trust him. He can pull off the taunting smile as Kate Shopshaw when she eats the unappealing village food without coming across as mean. And it can also compromise his dignity for comic effect whenever some enemy catches his character off guard, or when a thug climbs back on board the minecart and has a sidekick Short Round as a great addition, providing some of the best humor with his lovable smile-like ways and get us to get stuck into adventure. There's also a very fine small performance from Indian actor Roshan Seth, who's brilliant at appearing in model priority, yet with that hint of something sinister and makes it believable he could turn out to be a secret baddie, and it's great seeing Pat Roach as a buffery ruffian, bringing the appropriate level of menace to this part as well as his physical bulk. Yeah, many can argue Temple of Doom's not a great film, but no one can argue that the movie expanded the film industry in a time period when the film industry needed much reviving. Like, for example, of course I've already mentioned the PG-13 rating getting invented, because studio executives determined the film was too violent for young children, but not really disturbing enough for teenagers couldn't watch, hence that rating. And it was a great thing for the film industry because as a result of this film and Gremlins, films had more variety in subsequent years. and the off-screen relationship between Spielberg, Capshaw, and Harrison Ford led to greater performances during the filming of Temple of Doom. And Spielberg became quite enamored with Capshaw, who had a major role in the film, and years later they got happily married. They're still married to this day. Even if some viewers didn't like the film, wanted to appreciate the fact that Temple of Doom intertwined two lively souls, and to this day they are possibly the greatest and humblest celebrities. It's all thanks to Temple of Doom. And of course because of, well, Raiders and their other films. Okay? And officially made Indy an indestructible hero by the end of the film too, like, especially because this is the first time he actually fights the villain. And by the end of the film, like, Indy and his gang have been through a multitude of horrid situations, and every single obstacle that they face, and he gets them out of, and even after he's been tortured endlessly and possessed, in the end, Indy saves the day, which should make any viewer happy and a bit tearful. With a darker and often more gruesome tone, Temple of Doom even leads Jones from a brawl in the Shanghai bar to a mystical village in India. He learns from the local people that an evil man had stolen their stone and their children, and he will of course be on the quest to save them. Like, when it came to Temple of Doom, George Lucas said he always intended to make the film a lot darker than the original, especially in a similar way to how Empire Strikes Back was a dark second installment in the Star Wars original trilogy. And he certainly succeeded in making it dark. Like, Temple of Doom was definitely the first indie film I saw, and even with no knowledge of the series, its dark tone really struck for its own good. Like, it's really bone-chilling and macabre, and some jokes do land here, but they're not as funny as the jokes in Raiders were, because of the film's overall tone, like the disgusting dinner scene, for instance. And the reason why it was, like, not really PG levels of dark, but R-rated levels of dark, was because Lucas was going through a divorce, and Spielberg was kind of going through a similar situation too. So I think this might have also been the first time Spielberg made something less hopeful and unhappy, and it didn't really happen again until Schindler's List. And I also like they did not want to use the Nazis again and actually try to use different foes for once, because they didn't want to rehash Raiders. That's what to do with the follow-up. Use different foes. And even, heck, this movie even had some Star Wars references in here too. Like, the club at the beginning in Shanghai is called Club Obi-Wan. And one of the thuggy guards, the muscular one, is actually played by Pat Roach, who's one of the actors for Yoda. And one of the sacrifice scenes has this lightsaber sound effect for the lava pit doors. So there's some nice Star Wars throwbacks in here. And plus, like Revenge of the Empire, the darker, more violent tone. But when it comes to Star Wars, though, I'd argue the tone in this one is more like Revenge of the Sith's tone, as they're both the most violent of their films, and come close to Lucasfilm's being rated R. However, unlike Revenge of the Sith, which has an obvious downer ending because it's supposed to set up the events of A New Hope in the original trilogy, this movie actually has a happy ending. And Willie does get a bit annoying in most of her scenes, but at least what happens to her is actually funny, because there's something amusing about the elephant smacking her with his trunk over and over again, and she has a normal conversation with Indy. And Ford, however, is just as great as ever, even though Jones spends most of 95% of the time as the adventurer and not the professor in this film. He's so much more human than most action heroes were, because he's not always getting out of every situation himself, and he always gets beat up pretty bad. And Ford is great as being both humble and cool. And also interesting fact, like, we all know Kate Shapshaw, the actress for Willie, ended up becoming Spielberg's wife years after this movie. And now, guys, let's, of course, it's not a complete review by talking about the infamous scene of this movie. So let's talk about the scene that created the rating. After getting through a bug trap, Indy, Willie, and Short Round literally encounter something way worse than a bug trap. And maybe a bit too fast too, because I feel like there should have been more traps they had to go through than just some bug room. They finally find the thuggy room where a ceremony is happening. One involving human sacrifice, and we all get to witness how their sacrifice goes in this scene. How this scene basically goes is we see a prisoner getting literally sacrificed to Kali Ma by Mala Ram, the villain of the movie, who gets put in this little sacrifice, like, little carrying cage. Mala Ram then literally walks up to the guy, gets his hand, like, ready, goes into his chest, and rips his fucking heart right out of him on camera. Holy shit. I remember that as a kid disturbing the fuck out of me. It was the first film to become one of my huge childhood nightmares. Like, even worse, after this, the guy gets lowered to lava, and he burns alive on camera as well. Like, holy shit. Nostalgia Critic's reaction was gold. That was pretty much my reaction. Yeah, this is a scene where things get really dark. After we see they found the stones, and they have the stones, Indiana goes down to retrieve the stones, and we get to hear the agonizing, heartbreaking scenes of the children screaming in agony as they're being tortured, which is horrific to listen to. But he keeps hearing it, and he decides he's not going to leave who's ever being screaming in agony to be hurt or killed. He decides to go investigate, maybe even save the victim who's screaming. But sadly, this eventually gets... Unfortunately, that gets Short Round and Willie captured and spotted by another frightening moment when the guard hisses at them. Then Indy gets captured trying to save one of the kids because he just found the kids being tortured. He tries to save one of them, but he ends up getting captured himself, and is then tortured with voodoo, forced to drink blood, and sadly even becomes evil. Things couldn't have been less hopeful for Indiana Jones here. And outside of the fact that yes, much of this feels a bit too dark and out of place for Indiana Jones' adventure, and the movie's pacing does suffer a bit here because we get introduced to this third act finale way too early. The entire last half of the film is based on this one location, and much of it feels like it just drags on for too long. And then after Indy turns evil and Short Round becomes a slave, another sacrifice happens, and this time they're sacrificing Willie to test Indy's knowledge and see if his processing worked. The heart removal does not happen this time, because they wanted to test Indy's knowledge, and it turns out it worked because Indy does not free her and puts her other hand in the little chain thing, but Short Round had managed to escape around this time, and now he tries to snap Indy out of this evil trace by lightly torching with fire. It seems to not work, but when he says Shorty's his, he grabs him and he secretly says, "I'm alright, kid," and pretty much winks at him. It's not just saying that to Short Round, but it feels like he's even saying that to the audience who's watching the movie as well. I really love that moment right there. It's like he's literally telling the viewer that too. And he's finally back. And I love how the rest of the finale goes. Because once Short Round awakens Indy from his brainwashed state, we get back to the fun Indiana Jones stuff we all love. But there's another problem though. Once again, like we got introduced to this third act finale too early, we get 3 major action sequences back to back, all breakneck speed. I'm not against lengthy action sequences, but one of the things that both Raiders and Last Crusade know is their pacing for their action scenes. Most films knew when to slow down the movie, build up the anticipation, and then execute the action with pitch-perfect pacing and stunning direction by Spielberg. Of course, as the rest of the finale goes, he frees Willie before she can burn, and they go to defeat the Thuggy. Even more R-rated violence happens here when the muscular Thuggy, played by Pat Roach, literally gets crushed by the roller. Then Indy collects the stones, frees the children, and escaping an attempt by Ram to drown them, and they cross a rope bridge full of crocodiles below. Ram catches up to them, sadly, and it leads to Jones cutting the bridge in two and causing the Thuggies to fall to the crocodiles. And all 4 struggle to climb up the broken bridge. Molo Ram even literally is willing to let one of his own guards die so he can catch up to them, which makes him even more ruthless. And this is where Jones finally fights a foe for the first time in this franchise, and invokes the name of Shiva and causes the stones to burn through his satchel. Ram tries to grab one of them to steal him, but he falls into the river and he's devoured by the crocodiles brutally on camera, which is definitely the most satisfying death in this franchise. And soldiers arrive, led by this guy who was inspecting the palace they were staying at. And of course, the redeemed other ruler kid, who also got lightly torched, decided pretty much leaving the soldiers to the remaining cultists, and they capture all the cultists, or kill some of them, and Jones, Scott, and Short Round return to Mayapur and hand over their last remaining stone. And the villagers are reunited with their children, and Jones and Scott embrace. But there's more though. Indy also kind of wanted to give the rock to this whole little professor place, and Willie was like, why did you keep the rock? Wouldn't have gotten your fortune and glory. And Indy was like, nah, who knows, they would have put it in a museum and it would have just became a joke. It's just another rock collection. So yeah, that's also why I pretend this is a sequel. It kind of shows that Indy kind of learned his lesson when he gave him the Ark, and he didn't get any recognition for it. So that's why. He clearly knew he wouldn't get recognition, and they just would have hauled it off to a museum anyway, so it would have meant nothing. Hence why he gives the rock back to the village, and the villagers are reunited with their children. And it's a perfect ending right there. So I like how the finale goes back to the Indiana tone we all know and love. But, however, now we get on to the bad qualities, because there are good reasons this film is the weakest of the great 3. First off, yeah, the dark tone is known to put people off of this film, and that's why as a kid, this was the one I watched the least out of all 4. And like everyone else, I do find Willie Scott to be really annoying because all she does is scream and complain half the movie, but she does thankfully get more likable in the finale, and some of the stuff about Indians is pretty inaccurate, which I can't agree with, but I'm not going to get into that stuff here. And of course the third act, because I find the third act to feel way too rushed, and I feel like Indy and his two pals should have had more traps to go through before reaching the Thuggy area way too quickly than just bugs. Like, I don't really buy them getting there that fast. Literally just after dealing with a room of bugs and a booby trap, I think they should have gone through more areas than just that. And plus the Thuggy don't even get introduced to the final act of the movie, so if the Thuggy are the main villains, why wait till the finale to introduce them? Shouldn't they be introduced at a much more quicker time if they're the bad guys? Then just introduce them in the very final act? That kind of makes no sense in my eyes. However, they don't really bug me, and I still think Temple of Doom is a great sequel. Yes, guys, I don't care if it's a prequel. It's a sequel in my eyes. I refuse to call it a prequel. And I don't care if Steven Spielberg or George Lucas hate this movie. Temple of Doom is the worst movie you've ever made. No, it's not, guys. It's not the worst movie you've made. Okay? I'm sure Spielberg's made movies that are worse. And George Lucas has made some bad movies, I'll admit, like Strange Magic, for example. That was bad. I do like those two directors, guys, but there are some bad movies from them, I'm gonna admit. I still think this movie's refreshing and great regardless, and Temple of Doom is still a great follow-up. So in the end, Temple of Doom is worth a watch and buy for fans of Raiders that want to see Indy go on more adventures and see the closest thing to an R-rated Spielberg or Lucas movie. Anyways, that's it for my review of Temple of Doom. And wondering how I'm going to rate Temple of Doom? Here's how I'm going to rate this movie. So overall, if you love Raiders and want to see a follow-up with more gore, horror elements, and see what invented the PG-13 rating, then this is totally a must-watch and buy for fans of all those qualities. And if you're wondering how I'm going to rate Temple of Doom, I'm going to give Temple of Doom an 8 out of 10. There we go. That wraps up my review for Temple of Doom. And now you wonder what the next review is going to be. Well, my next review is going to be for another second installment of a franchise I'm also reviewing. And that film is going to be, of course, the second film of the Shrek series. And yeah, I'm also excited to talk about that one because that's my favorite of the Shrek series. And then next week we go back to Indiana Jones with, of course, the third film, The Last Crusade. aka the second best of the trilogy and the best of the follow-ups. Until then, guys, that'll be it for this review. Thank y'all for watching. If you like this and want to see more, don't forget to like and subscribe to Don G. Corleone.